Hello everyone. So we're making a Project Zero video here. Remember, Project Zero is not graded, but it's good for you to do it to get used to how we do things in EECS 281. Some of the things we do in this you're going to need in all of your other projects, and it gets you used to using our auto grader, etc. Now, I have a PC, I use Visual Studio. I'm going to demonstrate this with Visual Studio, but most of the stuff we're doing in this video is going to be independent of your operating system or IDE. Now we're going to have some infinite recursion for a second as I switch to sharing my entire desktop, which will show my OBS for a second. Okay, so here we're in our Project Zero.cpp, whatever IDE you're in. What we want to do is we want to go through these to-dos. Okay, to do, add a project identifier. Okay, well, I need the project identifier and I can get that from Canvas. It's in the Project Zero identifier.txt. You can download this file and copy it, or you can just, if you're careful, you can just highlight that and just either say right click and say copy, or you can just do Control-C to copy it. And then we'll go back to Visual Studio. And I like to get rid of to-dos as I do them. So I'll just put it over the top of that. We'll just paste it in there. Or I could even add to the beginning. Hey, there's my identifier. Okay, so that you've got to do, it'll have a different identifier for every project, and there'll be a text file somewhere that tells you what the identifier is. Okay, so now let's go through our to-dos. Let's scroll down a bit. Okay, this one, print help's already done. To-do, finish this function. Okay, well, I haven't finished this function, so let's not get rid of that to-do. There's some comments here. To do, fill in 2 lines, one for mode and one for the help options. Okay, what we need to understand here is what this is talking about. When you run programs at the Unix command prompt, let's just put in a comment here, like let's say I was running this project, and you can find out more about what the command line options that this Project Zero is going to use are. They're in the Project Zero PDF. So it's got in the Project Zero PDF, it's got the identifier. Don't copy stuff from a PDF. Never ever, got to get this out of the way, never ever copy stuff from a PDF. It's got invisible characters in it. That's why we made the separate TXT file. But it's got an overview of the project. It's got an overview of a bunch of different things in here, including the options, what's going to be on the command line, etc. So the options that we're going to have are things when we run the program, like /project zero, I want to put things on the command line that tell my program something about how it's supposed to run this time. Like --mode, no size, is a valid option. Mode is actually the option. Mode is the option, no size is the argument that goes with the option named mode. You can also do a short version of this. Instead of --mode, it could be -m. Now another possibility is you could do /project zero -- help. Help is not followed by something else. So mode is always followed by something else. Mode has a required argument. Help is never followed by anything else. Help has no argument. Now what we're going to do here is we're setting up a way. There's already a thing built into C++ called getOptLong that Visual Studio didn't include. We had to include that ourselves. With Visual Studio Code and the compiler that it uses, Xcode and the compiler that it uses, Kane, the autograder, getOptLong is already in place. It's a way to handle these for you. So what we've got to get used to is how to get the data ready so that getOptLong can do its job. So what that consists of is we're going to have to add some lines of code in here before this one. This one you always leave alone. It's always got to be the last thing in this long options. So long options here, basically what we're doing is we're creating an array of structures. So each entry here has to have a set of curly braces because we're defining elements of a structure. So I'm going to put in here, the first thing I put in is inside of double quotes is the long version, like mode. and then a comma. I like to line these up, just a little bit of pedantic editing on my part. Now we need to say, does mode have a required argument, or does mode have no argument? So mode has a required, and as you start typing, it should auto-fill in. Now this is why in Visual Studio we wanted to create the project before we open Visual Studio, because it should help you auto-complete here. So we can just double-click that and it'll fill it in. So we got a required argument. Then notice it's got exactly enough space. I planned ahead. There's always going to be a null pointer here because there's a feature of getOptLong we're not using. So we're always going to have a null pointer there. And then what we need here is inside of single quotes, we need the short version of the option, the single quote M. And then we need one more thing. We need a comma after the curly brace because this is one element of an array. And then there's a comma before the next structure. All right, so we took care of mode. Now we've got to take care of help. So we're going to put some curly braces in there. Oh, I don't like how that lined up. We'll line that up ourselves. Okay, whoops. So then help is the long version. Help has no arguments. That's no underscore. Oh, and here you don't even have to use your mouse. You down arrow, hit enter, it'll fill it in. At least in Visual Studio. Xcode, you might have to double click it or do something slightly different. But it should give you the same sort of help there. Okay, so mode has a required argument. Mode is always followed by another word that doesn't start with a dash or a minus sign. Help has no argument. Help is never followed by another word. Okay, so no argument, pretty much spaces, null pointer, and then the short version, single quote H, single quote. I like to put a space in there and then a comma there. And if you want these curly braces to line up, we can do that too. No big deal. Okay, so that took care of this first to do. So I'm just going to get rid of the word to do there because we did that. But it reminds us what we did and what it's accomplishing. Okay, now this is a place, the next to do down here is a little bit redundant. This is a little bit redundant because getOptLong is at least as older than you are, possibly twice as old as you are. It's been around for a while. They didn't plan ahead super well. They also had to deal with another function that was a short version of getOpt and blah, blah, blah. Anyway, what we need to put in here is we got to fill in the double quotes. We've got to fill in the same single letter versions as up above. We got to put an M and an H. However, we've also got to add something else. M must be followed by a required argument, so we put a single colon in here. So M colon means the short version M is followed by another word, and then H is not followed by anything. Okay, so let's get rid of that to do, because we did do this. We filled in the double quotes to match the mode and help options. So it's M colon, colon because mode has a required argument. H isn't followed by anything because H has no argument. Okay, let's go down further. Okay, there's some comments here about the error output. I don't see any other to-dos. Hey, guess we're done. So let's go back to the top of this get mode function and let's just get rid of that to-do. Now, you might say, hey, Dr. Paoletti, I bet our project 1 is going to be more complicated than this. I bet my mode is going to have to return more than one thing. How do I return more than one thing in only one string? Oh, that's easy. In project 1, you should do a better job than we did here with this simple project. In project 1, why don't you make a class? Why don't you make getMode a member function of the class? Then it could have a void return type, and whatever you need to remember would not be a local variable, it would be a class variable. So I'd make this like void, whatever project 1 class name colon colon get mode, and I'd get rid of this line and make mode a string member of the whatever my project 1 class is called. but that's going a little far afield. But remember this, when you get to project 1 and you need more options, make it a member function, void return type, and a bunch of member variables of your class. Okay, so we're done with that one. Let's see what else we have to do. Write this function. Okay, it should do the following. Okay, it should read in the size of the data to be read. It should use data resize to set the current size of the vector, and it should use a for loop to read in these values. So what we're looking at here is we've got to write a function that's going to read with resize. What that means is that the input file that we're going to get is going to have the size of the data. It's going to have basically line 1. And let's go look at that input file. Let's go see what that looks like. Where's my project 0? What does sample R look like? Sample R has a number up front, 127. 127 is the number of values that follow it. So what we want to do is we want to read this number in. We want to resize our vector to be the right size, and then we want to read this stuff into that vector that's exactly the right size. So that's what we're trying to accomplish here. Okay, so delete the following line of code. It's only here so that the file compiles. If there was nothing here, the compiler would have complained that we had a parameter that we never used. Okay, so we can get rid of all of that, and we got to do steps 1, 2, and 3. Okay, so step 1. Okay, so we've got to read in the size of the data, and I need a variable. If I'm going to read the size of the data, I need a variable of that to read it into. So let's make a size t variable, and let's call it size. And I'm going to read from cin. Our projects almost always read from cin. So I'm going to read in that size, size. And then, okay, so that's step 1. We're done. Okay, step 2. Okay, so for step 2, we want to use data.resize to set the size of the current vector. Okay, data.resize. Oh, look at that. It's helping fill it in for me. Parentheses. And oh, look at that. It gives me some help, some pop-up help saying, hey, this thing expects you to give it something of type size t. It will refer to it as underscore new size. That is the name of the parameter that it receives it as. Here I've got to give it the name of an argument, something that I have, which is size. Okay, so we have resized the vector. Okay. Now, let's move on to step 3. Okay, so it says, use a for loop to read in the specified number of values. Okay, so we knew, at least with this input file, it was going to be 127, but I need a for loop. Okay, so for, now I need a loop variable. Well, my loop variable, it would be useful to have it be the same type as size. Okay, so for size ti is equal to 0, I is less than size, plus I. Okay, and I like to, when I create curly braces, I like to comment them immediately. Always, always, always. If you get 5 levels deep of curly braces and you get confused, then it's a pain to comment them. It's easier to do it 1 level at a time. All right, so now what we got to do is we've got to read the value, and we want to read it basically directly into that vector. So I'm going to read in from cin goes directly into data square brackets I. I'm going to read it directly into that location within the vector. And that's it. I've done the to-dos for this one. Now, what we want to do is we want to test this. Now, first of all, let's see if it compiles. Build solution, or whatever your IDE has you do. Okay, it looks like it built. That's good. Now we've got to make sure that our command line is ready to go with resize, with the mode resize. So what I'm going to do here is this is where we're a little bit IDE dependent. So in Visual Studio, we got to change our properties, our debugging properties, and instead of no size here, I want resize. So it's mode resize, and I don't read from sample n. N is for no size. R is for resize and reserve. All right, so let's OK that. And now Let's try running that. Now, I'm going to have to, this is going to be a little bit of a pain, because I'm redirecting input, Visual Studio likes to close on me. I'm going to put a breakpoint on my very last return 0. Hopefully, it'll get there. So now let's say debug, start with debugging. Okay, now it popped back over to here to say I'm at the breakpoint. Let's look in the code, or let's look at the output. Hey, there we go. I've got my average, I've got my median. Hopefully those are the right values. This project looks like it's running and building. Now, go back over here and I want to say continue. I don't want to stop it. If there's any like leftover errors and stuff, I don't want to stop it and miss that happening. Let's continue and let it close naturally. Okay, so that takes care of getting part of the Project Zero stuff done. Now there's still other to-dos up here. So there's to-dos. Okay, so we did the read with resize is now done. We've got to do read with reserve and read with no size. Now, if you want to, you can go and write each of those yourself. Come back to the video. So we're going to do reserve next, and then we'll do no size. But really, I'd like you to go try these out yourself and see if it works. If you do reserve correctly, you should get exactly the same output that you did with resize. When you read with no size, you're going to have to change the command line so that you, with all of them, you're going to have to change the command line to change the mode to reserve or no size. And with no size, you're going to have to change the name of the input file. Okay, so let's now go through these. If you had trouble with them, hopefully you've come back now and we'll get your read with reserve done. Okay, so we're going to get rid of all this stuff because we don't need that. That says to get rid of it. Now we got to start doing these steps. Okay, so step 1. Okay, so read in the size of the data to read. Well, that's going to be exactly the same as read with resize. So let's just copy our step 1 here. Just copy those 3 lines. I can even just put that over the top of my comment here. Okay, so there, we're done with step 1. Step 2. Okay, so now it says use data.reserve to set the maximum size of the vector. So data.reserve, and then again, we've got to give it a new capacity. Well, all I've got is size, so I'll give it that. Now here it gets into what's the difference between resize and reserve. And really, I should have probably done this before we did any of the functions. Sorry about that. Okay, let's go through it now. Okay, so about resize and reserve and vectors. So when I say, hey, I've got a vector, like vector of double named data, and this is back in main. Oops, back in main. Okay, so that's back in main. What this vector is right now, it's a new vector. It has a size of 0 and a capacity of 0. Now you think of the size is what's in it right now. And the capacity is how big is dynamic memory behind the scenes. Now, if we don't do a resize or a reserve, if we just keep doing pushback, what happens is the vector grows by doubling. Now think of what if there was 1,100 of them. If there was 1,100 and we don't do anything and we let it grow by doubling, it would go from 0. Well, when we double, we have to go up to at least 1. So it would go up to 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, etc., 1,028. Then when it reads the 1,029th item, the vector would double and it would become size 2,048. But I'm only going to actually use 1,100. So if that happened, if I actually read 1,100 values, we would end up with a size equal to 1100 and a capacity might be equal to 2048 because it doubled and doubled and doubled and doubled. So if we don't know the size, we have to let it grow naturally. But if we know the size, it would be good to either resize the vector or reserve the vector. So here's where the resize and reserve are different. Resize generally affects both of them. Reserve affects only the capacity. So for instance, if I knew there were going to be 1100 values, so if I knew ahead of time there were going to be 1100, I could reserve room for 1100. Then as I push back, it never has to double. It has room for 1100 and it just puts them in the vector. So if I reserve 1100, the size would be 0. There's nothing in it now, but the capacity is 1100. But if I resize it to 1100, they would both be 1100. The capacity, the dynamic memory, would be size 1100. There would currently be 1100 in it, and they would all get default valued to, hey, a vector of doubles would all default to 0. Okay, so now that we know a little bit more about the difference here, we can get to step 3. So we're going to use step 3. We're going to use the for loop again. Oops, size t I is equal to 0. I is less than size plus I. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a temporary variable here. So I've got to have a place to put this value. So now I can read in, cin goes into temp, and now I can use data pushback to put that temporary value at the back of the vector. So I read in, let's say I read a size of 1100. I said reserve room for 1100, but right now, if I were to look at the vector size, the vector would say, I'm size 0, I don't have anything. If I look at square brackets 0, that would be invalid. But instead, I push back all of these values one at a time. Now, if this is right, let's build this and try running it. I should get exactly the same output as I did before. Yep, 13.3, 12.7, same values, that sounds good. Oh wait, I didn't change the command line. That was running with resize again. Let's change the command line. Reserve. Oops, my fingers are in the wrong place. Okay, there we go. Minus mode is reserve. And now, actually, let's go set a new breakpoint. Let's set a breakpoint here after it reads the mode, and let's step through it, okay? So stops here. If the mode was resize, it would have gone into there. If the mode is reserve, hey, look down at the bottom. Locals is basically all the variables inside of the current function. This is a sort of Visual Studio specific, but Xcode has something similar to autos. Autos is basically tell me what variables you think I'd like to know about. You can either change it back and forth, or you can also mouse over, and this is true of Xcode also, you can mouse over a variable and it'll tell you the value of the variable. Okay, so the mode is reserve. So if I step over, step into, here's my read with reserve. It says, okay, read in the size. What is the size? Size is 127. Reserve that vector. And now look at this. See, data vector says my size is 0. If I open it up, it says, my size is 0, but my capacity is 127. Now let's run through this, and we'll learn how to use the debugger a little bit. And Xcode is very similar to this. So we step over, we read a value into temp. Temp is 27. It's actually 27.0, I think it was in the file. And then we say data pushback temp. Oh, now the data vector closed up because its contents changed. If I open it back up again, it says, data vector size is 1, capacity is 127, and index 0 has a 27.0000 in it. Okay, let's run through one more. Read into temp. Temp has the value 0. Push back temp. Now my data vector closed up. We got to open it up again. 27 point lots of zeros, 0 point lots of zeros. Let's do one more. I want to get something other than 0. Hopefully I'm going to get one with something in the decimal portion. Temp is 0 again? Is that right? I don't remember. Well, that doesn't look right. Oh, I know the problem. I know the problem. I goofed. I made a mistake. I do that sometimes. Temp isn't a size T. Temp should be a double. You've probably been laughing at me for 5 minutes here. Okay, let's make that a double. That's the problem. Because when we tried to read the decimal point, it failed. And we haven't been reading anything. Okay, let's recompile that. All right, let's try this again. Okay. So we stop there, read with reserve. Let's step into that. Step in, we read the size is 127. Reserve it, temp, let's read it in. That should be the 27.1. Aha, 27.1. There we go. Now we read into temp and we get 25.8, 0.29999. It was actually 0.3, but we got a sort of a integer to binary, or not an integer, a decimal base 10 to binary conversion, slight round off error. Okay, so now I don't want to watch all 127 of those. We can go to, there's one up here called step out. Let's step out of that function. And then I'm just going to say, actually, I'm just going to say continue. Let's look at our output window. Aha, we really did get the same results there. 13.39, 12.7. Okay, that's good. All right, so we found our error there. All right, now let's go and do let's get rid of the to-do on read with reserve because we've gotten rid of that. And now let's do read with no size. So no size, the file has nothing in there. Okay, so let's delete that stuff we don't need. And there's no bunch of steps here, there's just a loop. So I need a while loop, and I need a place to read into. So I need double temp again. So now what I'm going to do is my while loop is going to say while cin successfully gets read into temp. Now, this is how you should read with a while loop. When you're reading until end of file, you should not be using .eof. You should not be using like .fail for the most part. We want to read in while the read succeeds. Now, I want to point you to someplace else on Canvas while we're here. Going to be really helpful this semester, really, really important. You'll hear me say it over and over in lecture. Resources, so Canvas files, resources, optimization tips. And the first thing in here is about file formats. There's about data types. There's memory optimization. There's, you can read all this later. There's speed optimization, and there's speeding up I/O, data structures, etc. And there's reading inputs. There's a whole section in here about reading input and the greater than that we're going to do now. So read a bunch of this stuff. Also, read the exam grade optimization. It tells you you should read this now. Don't read this 5 minutes before the midterm. This is something you should read now about things that you can do to help help your overall grade. Okay, so we're going to read into temp. So while we read into temp, I'm just going to do data.pushback temp. And that's it. This one's really simple. But this is the correct way to read until end of file. While you successfully read that thing that you want to read, do something with it. Now, we can build this, and hopefully it builds. Okay, now we got to go change the command line. So now we're going to change the mode, and oh, hey, let's change all of this. So instead of -m, let's do the long version, -- mode, no size, and then less than sample n. See, sample n doesn't have that integer at the front. It's just got all the doubles. Okay, so now let's run this. And let's step over this. Okay, so was it resize? No. Was it reserved? No. Was it no size? Yes, it was. So let's assume that worked. Let's just continue and see what the output looks like. Aha, 13.39, 12.7. Got the same results again. Sounds good. All right, and we've got a separate video on using the command line and using the makefile, etc., and uploading to the autograder. There's another video for that. I'm going to get infinite recursion here while I shut off my recording.